Hi, everyone. I can see you all signing on. Welcome. I'm going to give it a couple of minutes. Make sure everyone hops on.
Sorry.
Welcome, everyone. Hi, everyone putting where they're from in the chat. Hello. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to Making Your Online Language Teaching Positive, Practical, and Personal. My name is Joy McFarland. I am the Product Marketing Manager for the US and Canada. Welcome. I can see so many of you still hopping on. This is great. Welcome, welcome. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Couple of housekeeping things. Feel free to put any questions in the chat. We will get to you. We will have some Q&A at the end. So feel free to hold off if you do have a question, or if you have one during the chat, we'll make sure that we get to it. You will receive a certificate for this webinar, and it is being recorded. You will receive an email about those things within the next week. Thank you. And now I'm going to introduce our fabulous speaker today, one of our favorite authors here at National Geographic Learning, John Hughes. John Hughes is an award-winning ELT author with 30 years experience of teaching and teacher training. He has worked with learners and teachers from all over the world and is a well-known conference presenter. For us here at National Geographic Learning, he's an author on the course series Life, World English 3rd edition, Worldlink 4th edition, Success with Business, and Total Business. He's also the author of the methodology title, Critical Thinking in ELT. And we are very happy to have him here with us tonight. Thank you so much. And John, I will let you take it away.
Thank you very much. Nice to see lots of people here on a Thursday, well, afternoon for some of you. In the chat box, can you write what time it is with you? Because that way I know that you can hear me, and then I can also see what time it is. It's 9 o'clock in the evening for me. People in the United States, it's 3, 4 o'clock. Other people, some people, it's 10 o'clock. Lots of times flying by. Okay, so we've got a real sort of mix of people. Very nice to see you all. Very nice to be back here doing a webinar. The last time I did a webinar for National Geographic, the world seemed fairly normal, and since then it's all changed. So I'm going to be talking about making your online teaching positive, practical, and personal. I'm going to give a very, I hope, a very sort of practical session, a little bit of theory, but quite a lot of practical ideas. If you can be watching the chat box as well and using it, I'm going to be giving you 1 or 2 tasks along the way. As you know, if you've been to my webinars before, I like you to be active and doing some things. So I'll be giving you a few little tasks along the way. I'm glad you're ready to learn, Myra, from Myra Johanna. Okay, so let's get cracking. This webinar actually came out of a survey carried out by National Geographic in July, and possibly you took part in the survey. National Geographic was interested to know how teachers were coping with teaching online, and they asked a variety of questions, and many of you took part in the survey. They got about 6,800 responses from teachers all around the world, lots of different countries, from 123 different countries, and 87% of the people who answered the survey were teachers. It was all about questions about online teaching. Maybe you took part. If you remember taking part, you can say that you did in the chat box. There was lots of data came out of the survey, but the most interesting part of the data for me was the question, what are the main challenges? Okay, Susan did it. Just in the chat box, just say what you think's maybe one of the main challenges might have been that teachers mentioned. What have been what's been a main challenge? So socialization, active participation, integration, quieter students, students engagement, connectivity, engagement. Engagement comes up a lot, doesn't it? Internet access, keeping the students engaged, motivating them. These things are moving quickly, but we can see a lot of these words are being repeated. Let's take a look what the teachers said in the survey. About 1,000 of them responded that one of the biggest challenges was using the technology effectively. Internet access, but then using it in an effective way that was a kind of positive experience for the students. Second challenge, a lot more people said, 2,500 responded, providing interactive lessons. Remember, this was in July. So in March, April, everybody was just struggling to deal with the technology. By July, people were starting to think, well, okay, we can teach with Zoom or whatever the technology is, but how do we make it more interactive? So 2,500 said that. What was even more interesting was even more than that. 3,000 responded, said maintaining and engaging the learners, which is what some of you have been typing up. How do we keep that motivation going? It's a really tough challenge. And I looked at these challenges and I was interested in them because I've been doing online teaching since about 2004. I've done a lot of online teacher training and then online language teaching. And I was thinking about these challenges that were coming up. And for me, there were three key questions emerging. Teachers are asking, well, how can I make that initial experience more positive? When students log on and they have their first online lessons, how can I make it a positive experience? Because if it isn't a positive experience, if the technology is difficult, if it's hard to get into the lesson, instantly you've lost the students because it's not a positive experience. Students have got to know very quickly how the technology is going to operate. The other question, what are some practical ways of making it interactive? So the respondents said, we want interactive lessons. Now, the problem with technology, we can talk about activities that are sort of exciting and transformative, but it's got to be practical. It's got to be straightforward for the students to do and the teachers to put into practice. So when I say practical, it means something that realistically works. And sometimes simple is better. So what are some practical ways of making it interactive? And finally, how can I make the learning more personal? I'm saying this because if you've been to my webinars before, when we talk about motivation and engagement, I usually end up talking about personalization, because for me, if I want to engage students and motivate them and keep their interest, I need to personalize the language that we're teaching. And that's something else that needs to come out of today. We can talk about the technology and online learning, but always we don't want it to get in the way of language learning and motivation and interest in language learning. So we've got to keep personalizing the language learning in a format that actually can be almost depersonalizing. You can lose the personalization when you're dealing with technology. So we've got to think, how can we constantly make it personalized for the students? When I first thought about these challenges, I instantly went back to a model of online learning that I learnt about 20 years ago. And I'm really surprised that in all the many webinars online and talks about online learning, not many people have presented this model to teachers. So I thought I'd start off by presenting a model of online learning, which you might be familiar with, but you might not. And if you have heard of it before, I'm going to present it in a way that relates to English language teaching. It's quite a straightforward model. It's not revolutionary, but it provides a nice scaffold if you want to think about online learning, and it responds to the three challenges on the screen. Let's take a look. The model comes from somebody called Gilly Salmon, whose website is at the bottom, and I'll also reference her at the end. And she was one of the first people to attempt to define what makes successful online learning. She wrote a book about 20 years ago, and it's been reprinted. and it's incredibly effective, I think, because it's quite straightforward to understand, and it relates very clearly to the way most of us approach our language teaching. Let's take a look. It's called the 5-stage model. There are 5 stages, and it's structured so you go from 1 to 5. Let's look at stage 1, access, or what she calls access and motivation. For successful online learning, she would say that students have to have access to the technology, and that relates back to the first challenge that we saw from teachers, was the challenge of the technology. When she talks about access, she's talking about our job as a teacher is to make sure the students are familiar with the tech. So if you're using Zoom with them, they need to know very quickly how Zoom works. If they don't, they will lose interest and it won't be a positive experience. The other danger is that teachers often say, but my students know more about the technology than I do. So we're talking about digital literacy here. Your teenage students, or whatever age they are, may be digitally literate, but only in certain areas. They may know how to use social media or use their mobile phones, but they don't necessarily know how to use a learning management system platform properly, like Moodle, or they don't know how to use Zoom properly. See, we have to spend time helping students with access to the platform. It seems an obvious thing to say, but it's one of the reasons that online learning has been going wrong, because if students can't access it easily, it doesn't start out as a positive experience. It's the equivalent if students enrolled at your language school for face-to-face classes, and you said to the students, oh, your English lesson is in room upstairs, and you sent the students off looking for the room, but you didn't give them instructions on how to get the route to the room. It would be the equivalent of that. We wouldn't do it in a face-to-face context. So why with online learning wouldn't we give them instructions on how to access the classroom? That's stage 1. So we need to do that first of all. Stage 2, online socialization. Surprisingly, if you really want effective online learning, it's not that surprising actually that students need to kind of get to know each other and socialize. So it's a positive experience. You need to build an online community basically. And that's even if you're teaching students who you've taught face-to-face before. Learning online is different. You need to rebuild that community and build a community where people feel that they can say and share anything and collaborate basically, because it's important that the students are going to collaborate later on. Nice point, Kata. Yes, you can use the breakout rooms in Zoom. I'll come back to it later. So we've dealt with access, we've dealt with online socialization, we've got the students socializing. Then we get onto information exchange, which is essentially the teaching part. It's the bit where we're going to be presenting some language, checking students understand, and students are going to practice the language. So it's teaching. That's all level 3 is. It's the teacher exchanging information with the students. Level 4 is sometimes the level that we don't get to in online learning, and it's so important that we do. It's knowledge construction, and it's the bit where we have group work, critical thinking, problem solving. It's all about higher order thinking and getting the students to do more with the language they've learned at stage 3. And if you've been to my webinars before, you know I talk about lower order and higher order thinking a lot. The level 3 is more about the lower order thinking, receiving the information. Level 4 in this model is more about the group work, the critical thinking. For Gilly Salmon, it's all about knowledge construction, and it's going further in the online platform until we get to stage 5 is development. And development is all about creativity, the highest order of thinking. It's about personalization. It's personalizing the language for you and developing with the language, and then it's reflecting on your performance as a language learner. Now, with that scaffold, it gives you a very simple, straightforward structure of how to approach online learning, and it's not that different from face-to-face learning, really. and it shows you actually it's less complicated than perhaps we try to make it out to be, as long as the foundations are in place, and the foundations are access and online socialization. Everybody happy with that so far? I hope so. You can say whatever you think about it in the chat box. But now we're going to apply this 5-stage model to online learning with English. Okay, so I'm going to illustrate how this works. I'm glad you find Deborah and Laura. Good, here we go. So first of all, access, helping the students access the online learning. Now we can spend some time training the students how to use a platform, or how to use Zoom, or how to use Moodle. And we can give them instructions, and all of that is important so that when the students first join the course, they know what to do. But for me, the important thing is that students are also learning English. So it's an opportunity to do some language practice when we're helping students access the platform. Interesting comment, Glennie. You said it's great, but sometimes we don't have the right platform in the chat box. Well, one thing you need to do is find out what students' experience is of the platform. So if I was using Zoom, I would probably start my course, even if I knew the students, by giving them a poll to do. Which of these statements describe you? A, do you use it all the time for work or meeting friends? B, have you used it once or twice before? C, have you never used it? Feel free to type in the chat box. I suspect most of you will type A, probably because Zoom has been with us for ages. Yeah, you're all typing A. One person types C. Okay, bit of a mixture. The point is that already as the teacher, I know what the expertise in my class is. I know that most of you are familiar with Zoom, but some of you might not be, and I might need to spend some time helping you with access. I suspect 4 or 5 months ago, not all of you would have been typing A, okay? Simple as that, that's all access is. It's finding out what the students can do with the technology, but it's an opportunity to do it in English. Here's another example of this, and this is based on an article that I wrote for the In Focus website. So I'm going to give you links to this at the end. Here's another way of helping students. I give them this screenshot of the Zoom meeting window with the little arrows dotted around. And then on the left-hand side, I could give them instructions. I could say to the students, where's the microphone? Where's the video? Where's the breakout room? But instead, I've decided to do the exercise giving them the language in English that they're gonna need during my lessons. So for example, 1, can you unmute your mic, means that I might say that as a teacher, and then the answer is E. And then students look, it's in the top left corner of the screen. Okay, it's A. So they're matching these really useful phrases for talking about the technology and matching it to the screen. For me, this, as English teachers, this is more useful than me testing the students if they know where the things are on Zoom. Because yes, Rupa, I've turned it into an English lesson, as you just said in the chat box. That's all I'm doing. I'm giving them useful phrases. So it's access, but I'm teaching them English so they can see the value of it. So I'm making it a positive experience. Here's another similar exercise. I'll give you the links at the end so you can get to these exercises if you wanted to use them with your students or do something similar. You know, we all have problems with the technology. Problems come up. So I've got the problems on the left-hand side of the screen. You can't see another participant. No one can see you. The audio stopped working. Students have to match the problems to the functional expression. So I'm teaching the English they're gonna need to be able to manage Zoom. You might use a different platform, so you might need to adapt this exercise slightly, but this would work for Zoom, and you're teaching students really useful language. So it's an English lesson, but it's also about access to the technology. It's not that clever, but it's useful and it's effective. So they would just match them. And I'm pre-teaching language that I know that they're going to need. And sometimes I kind of role play situations, or I'll switch my sound off on purpose and I'll get a student to ask me the question that they need to ask. Like, can you turn your sound on, or something like that. So it's access, but it's teaching them English at the same time. Simple ideas, okay? That's all access is. It's getting the students familiar with the technology, but using English to make it a positive experience. Online socialization. We all know that for effective learning to happen, people need to socialize. They need to know about each other. And if you don't put in the foundations of online socialization early on in your learning course, students will not respond to you positively later on. So it's important, and even if you know the students from a face-to-face context, you can do interesting things with online socialization, either in Zoom, which is synchronous learning, or asynchronously if you were using a learning management system. Let me give you an example. I've been running an online course recently. It's actually a teacher training course. And normally we introduce ourselves. So I'm using Moodle, which is a management system. So I'm working with the students in an asynchronous way, but I wanted to introduce myself. So I could just introduce myself, say, hi, my name's John, I'm married, I have 2 kids. But it's so much more interesting if I add a photograph to it, for example. It's simple. It's personalizing it as well, and it's being creative, but it's encouraging the students then to go off and take a photograph and share the photograph with me. And on our learning management system, the students share the pictures. They could do it in Zoom as well. They could screen share, but this sharing of photographs can be quite time consuming and they need to go off and think about it. So it's quite good for a learning management system. But it's important to build that online socialization at the beginning. Let me give you another example of this, how you can do a similar kind of thing. This is, again, is with asynchronous learning. I photographed myself on holiday, and then I use a tool called PhotoBabble. It's one of my favorite little phone app tools. With PhotoBabble, it allows you to take a photograph, and then you can record yourself talking, and it's embedded into the photograph. This has all sorts of applications for language teachers, but this is just a simple one for online socialization. So I introduce myself to the students, and then I load the picture up, and they click on the link to PhotoBabble and they hear me talking. And this is, you should be able to hear me speaking when I click on it.
My name's John, and I'm going to be your teacher for this term. This is a photo I took over my summer holidays. It's on the Isle of Skye in Scotland. It was a very cold day, but very beautiful. Anyway,
Yes.
look forward to meeting you all in class. What I'd like you to do is follow the link below to PhotoBabble and take your own photo and record a similar introduction about yourself and post it here.
I like you, Lee. They're saying I'm handsome. Everybody else is saying what a great activity. You call me handsome. That's great. With the PhotoBabble, it's dead simple. You load it up, and then the students go off and take their own photograph, and they introduce themselves. And it's great because you're hearing a sample of their English. So straight away, you've got this record of the students speaking, and then you can start to analyze the difficulties they've got right from the beginning of the course. So it's online socialization, but it's allowing you to assess their English because they're recording it on PhotoBabble. They have a great time showing their photograph, and you've got all of that on your LMS. Now, you can do it live with Zoom. Students could just introduce themselves, but actually I think doing it asynchronously like this is kind of more interesting, and it's a good way of getting students to socialize right at the beginning. And even if students know each other from a face-to-face class, they'll find this interesting to do. So even if they know each other, they can go off and take a photograph and record it. And some of you in the chat box are mentioning other tools you use, like Voki, Deborah. There's that kind of tool. I mean, this isn't, Photobabble is one of many. I just like Photobabble because it's kind of straightforward. I don't think it's Jana, and you can set up passwords with Photobabble, and you can create closed groups so the photos are private and the class kind of shares the pictures amongst themselves. So it's a neat little tool. Julia's watching the webinar at midnight, yeah. Okay, one final activity. This is also an activity for a learning management system, but you could do it. This is an old English language teacher's tool that you use in face-to-face classes, but this is, I've adapted it and I use it on my Moodle course, my asynchronous course, to get the online socialization going. So I use a discussion forum and I post 3 sentences about me. 2 of them are true, 1 of them is false, and I invite the students to guess which one is false and then write 3 sentences about them. Christine has just said, I do this all the time as a warmer. Absolutely, you do it all the time face to face, but it's fantastic as an online activity as well. And I think it's a nice one to do if the students all know each other, because then you're getting them to socialize in a new way as well. So I'm not presenting something revolutionary. I'm just saying, take the activities that you do in class face to face and put them online, because actually sometimes they're more interesting online. Here's the response from one of my students. She guessed, her name was Jeanette, she guessed that number 1 was false, and then she wrote her 3 statements. And then another student came along and answered Jeanette and guessed which one of Jeanette's is wrong and wrote 3 of his. And then Jeanette came back and told him that he was wrong. Okay. Incidentally, for me, number 1 is wrong. I didn't grow up on a sheep farm. I grew up on a dairy farm, for anybody who's interested. The rest is all true. Okay. So that was online socialization. Stage 3 in the Salmon model is information exchange. Information exchange is quite straightforward, really. It's just teaching. And actually, when you use course materials, course books, digital version of the course books, maybe the classroom presentation tool, or the students have got the books at home and you're sharing the classroom presentation at home, it's often the book is on the screen and the teacher is passing on the information. And that's all that information exchange is. It's not that complicated. What's neat about information exchange on the screen, of course, if you have the right kind of tool like the classroom presentation tool or an ebook, it has little bits of added functionality. So this is a page from a book called World English. Type in the chat box if you've ever used World English. I'd be interested to see if anybody has. But this is the ebook version of World English. So I can run the class as I would normally with the course book on the screen. I may be doing the listenings, the gap fills and all of that. And I'm just teaching the class as normal. What's nice about the ebook, you'll see on the left-hand side, the ebook version has these flashcards. So when you come across a new word like costumes, you can type it onto the flashcard on the left-hand side, and then you can flip it around and you could write the definition, or you could put a gap fill in it, and then you can come back to the flashcards and you can test students at the end of the lesson. So it's a very practical, simple way of making the lesson interactive. It's not very complicated, it's not really high tech, it's not transformative, but it's simple, it's straightforward, and the key word, it's practical, okay? So a lot of the ebooks and the classroom presentation tools have that kind of thing. It's World English is the book. And I know that National Geographic Learning have put on all sorts of other webinars where people have talked about using the classroom presentation tool, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. that's an example of information exchange, and I just work through the exercises as normal. Here's another example of the ebook version where there's very simple functionality that's very practical. And on this ebook version, what I liked is that there's the real language feature in World English, where it picks out key words that students might find useful in there for real English. But it has this nice sticky note feature where students can add notes to their ebook. And for example, they could write the translation. So this student's written the Spanish translation of a dish and recipe, but they might write other things. They might write the definition or whatever. So little features they can just add on to help the information exchange. I want to tell you about information exchange, which I did with Zoom. And this is where Zoom gets really interesting, the way you use the chat box, but also the recording function to help with information exchange. So this is taken from Life PreIntermediate, and I was working with some students on job interviews. So we did the exercises in the book on Zoom on the screen. Okay, we worked through them together. Now, normally in my lesson, I'd then role play the interviews with students, but with Zoom, I kind of adapted it to make it a bit more interactive. What I said to my students was, what kind of interview questions do you think you'd be asked at the job interview? Can you type them into the chat box? So what the students did was brainstorm those questions in the chat box. There was a few students and they all typed them in, and I corrected them a little bit. Where there were mistakes, I corrected the questions from the chat box. Then we switched sound on, and I had students role play question and answer. Now it was a small group, there were just 4 students, so I could have 2 students role play the interview questions and what they answer, and the other 2 students listened and assessed. If you had a bigger class, I would put them all into the breakout rooms to practice these questions. But they've generated the questions, and now they're going to practice answering them for them. So it's very personal. But what's really cool is that when you're listening to the answers as the teacher, you can start to write down the difficulties. And the difficulties for these students was some of the pronunciation. So they were answering the questions and they were saying things like, I'd like to be a permanent researcher in a good university. But the student was having problems with word stress. So in the chat box, I could write permanent, and I wrote per in block capitals so they could see that was the stressed syllable. Another student had a problem with the word quality. In fact, I thought she'd said quarantine. And so we worked on the qua sound in quality. And again, I was typing with big letters in the chat box and little to show it. The word management, some of my students went management, and I showed them that it's management, and I typed man in block capitals. Analysis was another difficult word. 4 syllables, second syllable carries the stress, so I typed NA in block capitals. Clinical, 3 syllables, first syllables in block capitals. See what's happening here? We're using the technology in a way we can't do with face-to-face. Well, we can, and we can write these on the whiteboard, wouldn't they? But what's really cool about Zoom is that it has the record function. So as a teacher, I was able to record the correct pronunciation of these words, and then I recorded it and I sent them the recording of me saying the words so that at home they could listen to the Zoom recording, listen to me saying the words, and then they would repeat them. So I was personalizing the pronunciation practice. I couldn't do that in a face-to-face class, not easily. I could record it with my phone, but not as easily as with Zoom. So suddenly the recording function on Zoom, actually, I just think it has all sorts of benefits that you don't get in a face-to-face setting. So play with it. make a little, at the end of the lesson, record yourself saying the new vocabulary and then send the recording to the students so they're practicing the pronunciation. It's fantastic for pronunciation. Play with it. I've started experimenting with it a bit, but there you can see the chat room and the recording function helping the information exchange. Okay, recording has all sorts of other applications. You can get students practicing dialogues and recording themselves and then assessing it. Anna Maria's just mentioned it there in the chat box. But play with the recording function. It's really interesting. Which brings us to stage 4, because in a way, that last activity, which was using the course book as the springboard for the information exchange, actually became a form of knowledge construction. Remember that Salmon says knowledge construction is all about group work, higher order thinking, problem solving. It's about constructing new ideas, work with group work. Now, the key tool for this in Zoom or similar platforms for knowledge construction is the breakout room, because that's where the group work happens. And you've probably all got familiar with the breakout room and had fun with it, but it's so crucial in a lesson usually to build in some kind of activity with the breakout room. And if you're using a course book, it's actually very straightforward. This is again from World English, but I've just included this. Sorry, quick question from Robin. Would you record just a portion or always the whole class? No, I would just record a portion, Robin. I don't generally record the whole lesson. I just record little sections that I think are going to be relevant and useful. I'm quite particular about that. What you can see on the screen now is a spread from World English, and this is the new edition of World English. But World English, every lesson in World English is based around the idea that you introduce language or you do some quite controlled practice, but every lesson always finishes with a goal check, which is the moment that students have an activity and they demonstrate what they can do with the language. So it's very practical. It always has the goal check. And in this particular lesson, they're looking at the topic of travel and vacations, how they can make it more interesting. And the goal check in this lesson says, in small groups, plan an interesting vacation. So a familiar classroom activity for most of you, yeah? And in normal face-to-face class, you put them in little groups around the classroom. Of course, with Zoom, you send them to the breakout room. If you're teaching asynchronously in Moodle or something, you'd get them to work in a discussion forum and build up their ideas in a discussion forum. Or they could possibly use the chat box to brainstorm it. But ideally, the goal check would be about working in groups and some problem solving. Knowledge construction, level 4, that's all it is, Gilly Salmon. Okay. Let's take it another step now. This is another example of knowledge construction that might interest you. Plus, you will have never seen this book before because I've just finished writing it. I shouldn't be showing it to you, but I thought I'm going to show it. It comes from a book called Worldlink. We have a new edition of a book called Worldlink coming out next year. But I've written the B2 upper intermediate level to go with the series. So if you've seen Worldlink before, you certainly haven't seen this because this level's completely new. It's for the B2 level. And I like teachers to try out my materials with the course books, but I like to pilot the materials myself. So when I write a course book, I like to test it with students. And like you, I've been teaching students online. So I thought, well, let's try some exercises from this new course book with my students online. So I shared it on the screen and we focused on relative clauses. Everybody like relative clauses? Great area of grammar. Bit confusing, very difficult to tell. Is it defining? Is it non-defining? How exciting, Rosemary. Absolutely. Is it defining or non-defining? And all those little rules about do we use which, that, all of that. It's very B2, very upper intermediate. So I did my presentation, I did my information exchange, and I thought now I need some knowledge construction. So I went down the book, and in exercise D, students have a kind of creative thinking task. And what I thought I'd do was I'd take this task and put it on the whiteboard. So on Zoom, I can share it on the whiteboard. And the activity is this. Students are given a very boring story. This is a nice activity when you're teaching relative clauses. You give students a very boring story where nothing much happens, okay? So in this story, at the weekend, a man moved into the apartment block. He didn't know anyone in the building. His neighbors invited him to a party. The party started at 8 o'clock. He met lots of people. What I did with my students as a form of knowledge construction was say, let's add some relative clauses to this story to make it interesting. Now with my class, I had a small class, so they switched on their microphones and we talked and they brainstormed and I typed it into the whiteboard. You could have it done in the chat box, or you could send students to the breakout room for 15 minutes and they could expand the story in groups. Different ways to set it up, but it's a kind of knowledge construction activity. This is the first version of the story that my students came up with. I'll let you read it. They went crazy with the relative clauses. There's crazy relative clauses all over the place. There's more relative clauses than story. They went a bit mad. The other thing you'll notice as you're reading it is it contains lots of mistakes. I'll just let you finish reading it and I'll have a quick glass of water. Now for me, this, aside from the technology side of this, when you read writing at B2 level, you can usually recognize a B2 level student because they have that ability to use relative clauses in their writing. So when I'm reading writing by students and they want to go into an upper intermediate class, I'm looking for the relative clauses because it's a sign of a sophisticated writer. Now, of course, this exercise is not realistic because you wouldn't normally include that many relative clauses. But what we've done is taken the information exchange, the grammar presentation, and now we're constructing a new text by applying the relative clauses. What I actually did, once we put it on the whiteboard like this, I gave it to my students because I ran out of time in class. And I sent the text to students. I said, for homework, can you rewrite it so it becomes a better story, more correct? So one student sent me this version of the story back. And you can see the student's been working really hard. Suddenly she's thought, okay, I've got to have a relative clause. So at the weekend, which was lovely and sunny, it's a non-defining relative clause because we know which weekend it was. We don't need to define it. We're adding extra information. And as you read that corrected text, you'll see the relative clauses coming in and the students having to think, is it defining, non-defining? Do I need commas or not? And so they rewrite it. Now you could do this as a class. Students could do it in a breakout room, but it's great language practice. And it's very practical to do, but it's also involving knowledge construction. So you're maintaining the interest. It's very easy to teach relative clauses and for it to be really boring. Students stop being engaged, they stop being motivated, which is one of the issues that came up at the beginning from the teachers about using technology and online learning. But if we think about knowledge construction, to an activity, we suddenly think, oh, hang on, what happens if we get students to work in groups or just to work together as a class? And you, the teacher, you're typing on the whiteboard and the students are making the suggestions and you're kind of reformulating the language as you go along. And together as a class, you're constructing knowledge. So we've gone from information exchange into knowledge construction, but a nice writing activity. If you're teaching B2 level students tomorrow, there's your class on relative clauses, okay? And Worldlink is out next year. Okay, which brings me to level 5, development. We're nearly there, we're nearly finished. We got to the top of the Gilly Salmon ladder. We've got development. Development is all about creativity, it's about personalization, and it's about reflection. And it's that moment in which the student demonstrates they've learned some language, they've practiced it, now they really want to show how good they are with the language. And they're probably going to write something or speak so that we have a chance as teachers to assess them, or they have the chance to self-assess. So in that last activity with relative clauses, we went from knowledge construction to the point of development where a student sent me the corrected version, and she's demonstrating her development, her ability to use relative clauses. Let me give you another example of what development might look like in the class. Here's a page from my book, Life. It's the pre-intermediate book, and if you're familiar with Life, we have a speaking page, and on this speaking page, students were required to practice the language they need for talking about pictures and photos, because National Geographic books are full of them. So I did the pre-work, the information exchange, and then at the end, the last activity on the page is that students choose a picture and they show it to their partner and they talk about it. Now, if I was doing a face-to-face class, my students might be allowed to switch on their phone, find a photo and present it to their partner. But it can be time consuming, and if they're not allowed to use their phones in class, you might have to set this for homework and say, bring in a photograph to class on the next day. If you're teaching online, you've got so much more flexibility, because of course you can say to the students, go onto the internet, find me a nice photograph, and then share it on Zoom and describe it to the class. So you have that flexibility. The other really cool thing about National Geographic Learning materials is that they're usually based on authentic people. So if you're teaching with Life online, whatever it is you're reading about or looking at probably is authentic. And I based this lesson on the photos of Rainer Gerritsen. I love his photograph. He takes wonderful photographs of people. So in this lesson, if I'm teaching it online, I don't have to say to the students, go and find a photo. I can say to them, go to the website of Rainer Gerritsen and have a look through his photos, because they're online. So they go on the internet, they go to his website, and they start looking through all his other photos, because the photo in the book is by Rainer, but he also has a load of photos on his website. And if you're describing photographs, describing appearance, describing people in your lessons, his photographs are fantastic. Very authentic. So students would have a look at his website, choose a photo, and then present it on Zoom and demonstrate their development. And other students could give feedback or ask questions and so on. That's all really development is. It's about personalization, presenting, being creative. Might be their own photos, might be somebody else's. At the beginning of the session, I mentioned photobabble. Here's another example of photobabble where I'm teaching the students asynchronously. I have a learning management system, and I say for homework, take your photograph, load it into photobabble, and then record your presentation about your photograph. So this photograph came from a lesson I did about holidays and travel, and I asked students to take a photograph from their holiday, put it on photobabble, and tell the rest of the class about the photo, where they took it, what it shows, and so on. It's the same activity, but I'm doing it asynchronously, and they're demonstrating their development. So simple ideas, practical, but now we're on to the level of, to create engagement and motivation, we want it to be personalized. And so this activity, getting students to create the photos and make the recording, is personalizing the language. And because you're already online, it lends itself to online teaching as well. And there are other apps you could use, other ways you could do it. You could use Loom, for example. Loom is video tool. You can do similar kind of thing. But it's all about development. My last activity before we finish. Julie Salmon would also say that stage 5 development is about getting the students to reflect. There was a question on the relative clause lesson. It's a 90-minute lesson, Sophie, by the time you've presented the relative clauses and practiced it, okay? Julie Salmon, with developments, talks about the importance of self-reflection, okay? Students should, at this stage, should be reflecting on how they're doing. So they should be learning to self-assess, and they should be reflecting on their own performance. So if they record themselves, for example, describing a picture, they can listen back to themselves and they can self-assess and reflect on how they're getting better. I'm a big fan of students recording themselves because they can record something 2 weeks ago and then record it yesterday and they can hear the improvement. So I might get them to record a description of their holiday and then get them to record it again 2 weeks later to hear the progress, and they're recognizing the development. The other thing I would do with online learning is to get students reflect about how they're learning. So maybe spend a bit of time getting them to think about and talk about the differences between learning face-to-face with the teacher in the classroom and learning online. And it's a useful discussion to have with students to get them to think about what do they like, what do they don't like, how could we make what they don't like more positive. And in this way, they're personalizing, but they're also making the experience positive. And it relates back to access at level 1, that idea of how do I make the online learning, the technology, a more positive experience. I want to finish with an activity that I adapted from Julie Salmon. I've changed it, but it comes from her book. And it's a reflection activity for students who are learning in a learning management system. And she says there are 9 different types of animals when it comes to online learning and posting things online. This would also be true with social media. So here's the text. What type of online learner are you? I thought we'd finish. I'd like you to read the descriptions and in the chat box, reflect on what type of online learner are you? Are you a wolf, an elephant, a squirrel, a mouse, a rabbit, a lion, a magpie, or a dolphin? Just read it, a couple of minutes, and then start to type in the chat box. Which describes you? Marjorie's a dolphin. This is particular for learner management systems where people have to visit asynchronously, but it's also true for use of social media. It's kind of fun. It's interesting to think, how does it relate to the animal? And everybody gets to describe themselves as dolphins and squirrels and rabbits, which is kind of stupid, but fun at the same time. And I kind of like it. But what's interesting about the activity is that students are reflecting on the way they learn. And it's also interesting because you can give students this type of activity halfway through an online course and they'll say, oh, well, I'm a wolf. And then they think about what that means in terms of learning. And then they go back to this activity 5 weeks later and they say, well, actually, I've become more of a dolphin because I've got more confident with the online learning platform. And they can see the development through the reflection in how they like to learn online. I think you could use this activity. I adapted it from the Salmon activity. You could probably use it with low intermediate students as long as they knew the animals. You might need photographs of the animals. But it's an interesting kind of exercise. And it's a good way into the topic of how do you learn best and how do you learn online. And it's all part of that development process. So development is about obviously the language learning, but it's also thinking about how you learn and how you like to learn or don't learn. Okay. So people are still typing in animals. We've nearly come to the end of the session. I'm going to sum up there's the 5-stage model from Salmon. As I say, it's 20 years old, which in terms of online teaching, it's an old model. But for me, I've seen lots of new models recently, and for me, they're all a bit overcomplicated. And I like this piece of scaffolding as an online sort of learning model to follow. And it's very similar to what we do in a normal classroom, except level 1 and level 2, it reminds us of the importance of helping students at the beginning with the technology and encouraging them to socialize so that their group work and their development's much better later. Those were the key words: familiarity with the tech, building the online community, presenting and checking, group work, critical thinking, creativity, personalization, and reflection. And I feel that the teachers who had these challenges, I won't have solved every problem for these teachers, but I do think by applying the Salmon model and thinking about how does it relate to language teaching, we are addressing those challenges and we're making it a more positive experience. We're making the activities more practical, more interactive, and more personal. References during this session, I used extracts from World English 3rd edition, Life 2nd edition, and Worldlink 4th edition, which you'll see comes out next year. Okay, so look out for that. The references: Gilly Salmon has a website. If you Google Gilly Salmon 5-stage model, you'll find her website. But fantastic book she wrote called E-Moderating. She first wrote it in about 2001. The 3rd edition was 2011. The links there to the InFocus site, you can go to the InFocus site, but I wrote 2 articles on Zoom in the classroom and also the use of the recording function in Zoom. So take a look at that. The links are there. And if you wanted to see more about the kind of work I'm doing, you can go to John Hughes ELT. There's information about my National Geographic Learning books and the kind of work I do and the blog posts. Thank you very much for listening. We've got a few minutes before 9 o'clock, and I'm going to ask Joy if we have any questions that I need to deal with.
Sure, thanks so much, John.
Feedback in the chat box. Nice.
Yes, you are getting quite a few accolades there. Fabulous, fabulous. And someone is saying, please, more webinars. I think mainly just a couple of kind of technical questions on your ideas with Photobabble and the photo ideas. Laura Stanchu says, can students load the photo and recording to Google Classroom, for example?
Yeah, what happens with Photobabble is you have to provide the link. So you sign on. You can create a closed group with Photobabble, but you can also just take the URL link that it generates. So it generates a link with every photo and audio recording, and you can load it up into Google Classrooms, and the students would click on it and it would take them to the Photobabble.
Cool. And one other Photobabble question for you, John,
yeah.
is does everyone need to download the app in order to do that as a class?
You don't have to download the app. You can go to it online, but you have to register with the teacher can set up the password and share the password with the students.
Okay.
So if students didn't want to download the app, they could just go to the website. But if you don't want to use Photobabble, there are other tools out there. But I mean, for example, you could do the same with Loom. So that recording I used to Photobabble, I copied it with Loom actually for the purpose of this presentation. And I use Loom a lot, particularly for the access stage. If I'm teaching an online course and I'm using a learning management system, for the beginning stage, the access stage, I often record my screen with me on Loom and I show the students around the platform. And so if I was using Google Classrooms, I'd record myself using Google Classrooms using Loom, and then I would send students the Loom video at the beginning of the course so they'd see me presenting it, and that would help with the access. And it's also good practice for listening to English as well. I went off on a tangent there, Joy, sorry.
That's okay. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for your time today. Thank you, John, for your time and this wonderful presentation. I know we all got a lot out of it. There are some more questions, but unfortunately we're out of time. Thank you. And yes, to all of you asking, you will be receiving an email with a certificate and a recording, link to a recording of this webinar. Thank you all for your time. We appreciate it. Have a great rest of your night.
Thanks everybody for coming. Bye. Happy teaching.